The morning air at the training compound carried the faint scent of spent gunpowder mixed with the salt of the ocean breeze. The sun had only just begun to edge over the horizon, spilling pale gold across the shooting ranges and the surrounding hills. Most of the base was still in that half-awake state, but the range maintenance crew was already at work, moving with practiced rhythm among the targets, the sandbags, and the neat stacks of ammunition crates. Sophia arrived precisely as she always did. Well before the official start of the day, her dark hair was pulled back into a simple braid, her eyes scanning the area with an attention that seemed casual yet absorbed everything. She moved in silence as she set out fresh paper targets, replaced splintered boards, and swept up brass casings from the gravel. The sound of metal against broom bristles accompanied the distant rhythmic pop of early weapons testing. To anyone watching, she was simply another worker, one of those background presences you noticed only when they were gone. The men of the elite training unit hardly registered her. To them, she was the woman who fixed the ranges after they had torn them apart with gunfire. She patched what needed patching, replaced what needed replacing, and kept her head down. In their world of tactical maneuvers, precision drills, and hardened reputations, she was invisible. Yet in truth, her story was nothing like what they assumed. Sophia carried the legacy of a man who had once been a ghost on the battlefield. Her grandfather, Master Sergeant Elias Ward, had been one of the most formidable snipers the Army Special Forces had ever seen. His time in the Vietnam conflict had etched his name into whispered conversations among soldiers who understood what skill on that level meant. 130 confirmed kills, missions completed against impossible odds, and an instinct for survival that defied training manuals. After his service ended, he had returned to a quiet ranch in the wide reaches of Montana, where the noise of war was replaced by the whisper of wind over open fields. It was there that Sophia had grown up, spending her days in a world far removed from the sharp lines of military life, yet shaped by it all the same. From the time she was old enough to lift a rifle, her grandfather had been her teacher. Every weekend they would drive out beyond the far fence lines, to hidden stretches of land where no one could disturb them. There she learned to read the wind by the bend of a blade of grass, to measure distance by instinct, and to slow her breathing until the world seemed to pause with her. Little bird, he would call her, not because she was fragile, but because she learned to wait motionless and strike at the exact right moment. Her training went beyond what any standard sniper course offered. Her grandfather taught her to remain invisible not just in sight, but in presence, to move like part of the terrain, to anticipate what an enemy might think before they thought it, to consider the rifle as nothing more than an extension of her mind. When she entered civilian marksmanship competitions as a teenager under false names, she routinely outshot men twice her age, but those victories were kept quiet, her identity guarded, by her grandfather, who knew the system would not be ready to see her for what she was. After earning a degree in mechanical engineering with a focus on ballistics, Sophia tried to bring her skills into military service. Her scores and evaluations broke records, her precision was unmatched, yet the doors to combat positions remained closed. The rejections were polite but firm, steering her toward technical or support roles. There was no place for her in the role she had spent her life preparing for, so she accepted a job where she could at least remain close to the world she wanted, maintaining the training grounds at one of the most prestigious bases in the country, the same grounds where the best were molded. For 2 years, she worked under the radar, watching the drills, memorizing tactics, quietly evaluating the strengths and flaws of the soldiers who never thought to wonder what she might know. When she finished her shifts, she went to remote ranges across the state, practicing for hours until darkness made the targets vanish from sight. She became a master of patience, waiting for something, though she could not have said what, that might allow her to step out of the shadows. Commander Robert Hale was the one in charge of the team that trained her most often, a man with nearly 2 decades of operational experience in hostile regions. He had the respect of his soldiers, the trust of his superiors, and the kind of battlefield composure that only came from surviving situations that could have gone either way. He knew of Sophia in the same way a person knows the janitor in their building, by role, not by person. To him, she was reliable, efficient, and entirely unremarkable in any way that might be relevant to combat. On that morning, there was no sign that anything would be different. The team was running complex urban engagement drills, setting up for the final run of the morning. The range was alive with movement, the sound of commands, the clatter of equipment, and the sharp crack of rifles. Sophia was working at the far end, adjusting target stands, the sun rising higher and glinting off the long barrel of a rifle in the distance. She thought she saw a flicker of movement on the hill beyond the base perimeter, but the moment passed, and she turned back to her work. At 0847, the quiet morning fractured. A sound like the sky splitting open thundered across the range as a mortar round exploded against the far building. Dust and debris lifted into the air, and then the second blast came closer. The screams and shouts of soldiers mixed with the short, sharp bursts of gunfire. Sophia hit the ground as instinct took over, fragments of shattered concrete showering her. She rolled behind a barrier and scanned the high ground, spotting the telltale flash of a rifle. Muzzle from a camouflage position. Around her, chaos unfolded. Robert's team scrambled for cover, trapped between overlapping lines of fire. The incoming rounds were deliberate, controlled, as if the attackers had studied the base and its routines. There was no panic in Sophia's mind, only a fast, clear map of the terrain and the danger. She began counting shots, calculating distances, estimating the resources it would take to break the assault. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that the moment she had been waiting for might have finally arrived. The air vibrated with the percussion of gunfire as enemy rounds chewed into walls and barriers. The sharp metallic smell of blood and burning fragments mixed with the grit that coated the tongue. Robert's voice cut through the noise as he directed his team, his command steady but clipped. They were pinned down in a crossfire, the kind of trap that could unravel even the best trained unit in minutes. From her position behind a shattered equipment cart, Sophia could see that the attackers had taken the high ground on three sides. Their sniper fire was precise, methodical, and unrelenting. They were using the landscape against the defenders, leveraging the hills and scattered cover to keep the team pressed flat and unable to advance or retreat. She could make out at least two enemy marksmen working in tandem, alternating shots to keep the defenders guessing. Somewhere in the rhythm of their fire she sensed a pattern, a beat she could break if given the chance. Michael, the team's designated marksman, was down, his shoulder hit badly. The rifle he had been using lay beside him, untouched now except for the spatter of dirt where bullets had struck nearby. Emma, the communications specialist, had taken shrapnel to the leg and was dragging herself toward cover with John hauling her the rest of the way. Every movement risked drawing another burst of fire. Robert's jaw was tight as he tried to keep track of wounded positions and incoming threats, but every second they stayed pinned was another second the attackers closed in. Sophia's mind worked as fast as her pulse. Her grandfather had drilled it into her that survival was not about reacting, but about acting at the right moment. She knew exactly what she needed: elevation, a clear line of sight, and the means to deliver shots before the enemy could adjust. She glanced toward the observation tower, its metal frame jutting above the chaos. From there she could see every firing position, every possible angle, and every blind spot, but it was exposed, a death trap for anyone without the skill to stay unseen on the climb. She slid low across the gravel toward the storage shed, her movements deliberate, keeping herself in the shadows cast by scattered debris. Bullets cracked into the ground inches away, sending chips of stone across her hands. She ignored the sting, her focus locked on the shed door. Inside she found the long case she had seen 100 times, but never touched while on duty. She flipped the latches and lifted the Mark 11 precision rifle free. The weight was familiar, comforting, the rifle settling into her grip as if it belonged there all along. Robert spotted her then, his voice carrying over the din as he demanded to know what she thought she was doing. She met his gaze across the distance, her eyes steady, her mind already making adjustments for wind and range. She called out that she could take the sniper positions from the tower if he gave her the spotting scope and radio channel. For a moment he just stared, as if the idea was absurd. A civilian maintenance worker volunteering to engage in the middle of a firefight. But then Another burst of enemy rounds slammed into the barrier beside him, and he looked at Michael, bleeding and pale, unable to lift his weapon. Robert made his decision in the space between two heartbeats. He told Michael to hand over his scope and headset. Michael hesitated only a moment before passing them to Sophia, his expression caught between disbelief and something else, maybe the flicker of hope that she could do what she claimed. Robert locked eyes with her as she slung the rifle and the scope into place, his voice low and hard. "If you cannot do this, tell me now. I will not send you up there to die." Her reply was calm, almost too calm for the chaos around them. "This is what I was made for." With that, she moved, hugging the low ground and weaving between cover. The rifle balanced perfectly in her hands. Every motion measured, every step planned. She reached the base of the tower and paused, scanning the ridgeline to time her climb between the enemy's shooting rhythm. Then she ascended, one careful rung at a time, the metal creaking under her weight, but not enough to betray her position. Halfway up, she flattened herself against the frame as a sweep of fire ripped past, then continued, her breathing steady, her eyes locked on the final platform. At the top, she set the rifle down and crouched low, unhurried despite the urgency. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. Haste is the enemy of precision. She adjusted the bipod, aligned the scope, and let her gaze sweep over the hills. There, at 2 o'clock, she spotted the first sniper, partially hidden behind scrub, his rifle just visible through the foliage. She called the position in to Robert over the headset. Wind drift 5 clicks left. Target at 600 meters elevation. Adjusted standby. The rifle bucked gently against her shoulder as she squeezed the trigger, the shot cutting clean across the range. The figure through the scope jerked once and fell back into the brush, his weapon tumbling from view. She was already moving to the next position before Robert could acknowledge the kill. Another sniper on the opposite rise, angled to fire toward the main gate. This one shifted position just as she sighted him, forcing her to track the motion through the scope. She calculated the lead in her mind, exhaled, and sent the second round on its way. The figure dropped into the dirt, motionless. 2 targets down in under a minute. Robert's voice over the channel was clipped, but carried something new. Not disbelief now, but recognition. She kept working, scanning for movement, marking threats. The next was a machine gunner pouring suppressive fire toward the entrance where reinforcements were trying to push through. The shot required a longer range and a steeper angle. She made the calculations, adjusted her hold, and fired. The gunner slumped forward, the heavy weapon falling silent. The tide began to shift, the defenders pushing forward under the sudden break in fire. Sophia did not stop. She found 2 spotters working for the mortar team, predicting their next steps and putting rounds exactly where they would be. Both went down before they realized they had been seen. The coordinated assault that had seemed so overwhelming minutes before was breaking apart, enemy fire thinning as their key positions collapsed. From the ground below, the soldiers who had barely noticed her presence for years now moved with renewed energy, driving the attackers back toward the hills. Sophia kept her scope trained on the retreat, ensuring no one lingered to launch a last desperate shot. When it was clear the threat had ended, she began the slow, deliberate process of securing her rifle, her hands steady, her breathing unchanged, as if she had simply finished a routine task. The echo of the last shot faded into the wind that swept over the range. The crack and thunder of the fight replaced by the scattered shouts of soldiers moving to secure the perimeter. Boots pounded against gravel. The metallic clatter of weapons being reloaded or cleared sounded sharp in the air. Sophia rose from her crouch and slung the rifle across her back, the Mark 11 settling there like an old companion. She swept her gaze over the hills one final time, ensuring no movement, no lingering threat. Only the stillness of a fight abruptly ended. Below, Robert was already on the move, checking on the wounded, directing his team to push toward the northeast where the last of the enemy had fled. His voice was firm, but the urgency that had filled it minutes earlier had shifted into something else, a tone that carried both relief and unanswered questions. He kept glancing up toward the tower, his eyes tracking the dark silhouette of the woman descending rung by rung, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as though she were stepping down from Nothing more than routine maintenance. When her boots touched the ground, the air around her seemed to shift. Soldiers who had not spoken her name in 2 years now stared at her openly. Michael leaned against a barrier, blood soaking his sleeve, but his eyes followed her with something close to disbelief. Emma sat with her injured legs stretched out, a medic working over her, and still her gaze kept flicking toward Sophia. John, his rifle resting against his shoulder, simply watched, as though trying to fit this version of her over. The one he thought he knew. Robert stepped forward until they stood a pace apart, the smell of dust and cordite still heavy between them. He held the spotting scope in one hand, the headset dangling from the other. His voice came low. "I need to understand what just happened out there." She handed him the rifle first, then the headset, her hands steady, her eyes calm. "I did what needed to be done." Robert shook his head slowly. "No. What you did was something that most trained snipers would hesitate to attempt under fire. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" For a moment, she looked at him in silence, her gaze traveling past him to the rest of the team, to the men and women who had walked past her 100 times without really seeing her. Then her voice came quiet but certain. "My grandfather taught me, Master Sergeant Elias Ward, Army Special Forces, sniper in Vietnam. He showed me everything the manuals leave out, the way to disappear in plain sight, the way to think 2 steps ahead of the shot." She didn't add that he had also taught her how to endure being underestimated until the moment it mattered. The silence stretched out, broken only by the occasional report of a distant weapon as the perimeter teams finished their sweep. Robert's expression shifted as he processed the name, recognition flickering there. The story of Elias Ward had traveled far in the military world, the kind of legend you half expect to be exaggerated until you meet someone shaped by it. His gaze sharpened, and then softened, as though the pieces had begun to fall into place. He asked her why she had never told them, never let them know she could do this. Her answer came without hesitation. "When would I have told you? No one ever asked." Around them, the quick reaction force finally arrived, too late for the fight, their vehicles kicking up dust as they rolled across the training yard. They found the attackers gone and the defenders regrouping. They found Robert's team intact though bloodied, and they found a story already beginning to form among the ranks. A story about the woman who had turned the tide in less than 20 minutes from an elevated perch with a borrowed rifle. The medics moved quickly, loading Michael onto a stretcher, stabilizing Emma's leg, checking minor injuries across the rest of the team. The mechanics of post-battle work hummed around Sophia, yet she stood at the center of it without stepping forward or stepping back. Her presence was quiet but undeniable now. The same soldiers who once brushed past her without a glance now gave her nods of respect, some tentative, some lingering a moment longer, as though they were still trying to reconcile her coveralls with the precision they had just witnessed. Robert called for her again before she could fade back into her duties, his tone different now, less a commander addressing support staff and more a leader speaking to an equal. He told her the after-action report would reflect her role in the engagement. But more than that, he wanted to understand the depth of her training, her capabilities, her experience as they walked across the range together. She described the years on her grandfather's land, the competitions under false names, the countless hours spent practicing in isolation, how she had chosen this job because it kept her near the skills she refused to let rust away. By the time they reached the command post, the first formal questions were beginning, officers from the base wanting details of the attack, the positions of the enemy, the sequence of events. Sophia spoke when Robert asked her to, giving precise descriptions, distances, the timing between each engagement, her voice steady, her details exact. The officers exchanged glances but asked no further about how she had known to act or how she had made the shots. Robert noticed and filed a reaction. Away, already planning his own conversation with the chain of command. As dusk began to settle over the base, the debris from the fight was being cleared. The hills scanned for any sign of a returning threat. The team had been ordered to stand down for the night. Robert found her once more near the equipment shed, wiping down the Mark 11 before returning it to its case. He told her directly that this would not be the end of the conversation, that her place here was about to change. She met his words with a nod, not with excitement, but with a quiet acceptance of someone who had always known the truth would surface eventually. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she thought of her grandfather, of the afternoons in the long grass with the distant sound of his voice guiding her breathing, of the way he had said that the real test of skill was not the shot itself but the moment before it, the choice to act. She had waited years for that moment, and when it came, she had stepped into it without hesitation. Now the waiting was over, and whatever came next would not find her unprepared. Night settled over the base with a slow, heavy weight, the last streaks of fading light swallowed by sky that seemed deeper than usual, the stars dimmed by the haze still drifting from the earlier explosions. Floodlights lit the perimeter in harsh cones, casting long shadows that swayed across the broken ground. The training yard bore the scars of the fight: scorched walls, shattered barriers, pitted ground where mortars had struck. Yet the air held a strange calm, the kind that follows only after the certainty that the danger has passed. Inside the command post, the room hummed with low voices and the faint crackle of radio traffic. Robert stood at the center, his uniform still dusted with dirt and streaks from the day's battle. Officers gathered around the long table leaned in over maps and reports, their pens scratching notes as each detail of the engagement was laid out. The timeline was precise, the locations of enemy positions marked with quick black circles, the sequence of events charted minute by minute, and at the center of it all, one point of change: the moment the fire from the hills went silent. Sophia sat slightly apart from the main cluster, her posture composed, her hands folded in her lap. She spoke only when Robert asked for clarification, each answer measured, stripped of anything unnecessary, just distances, wind direction, estimated range, and results. She did not embellish, did not claim more than what was. Yet every person in that room understood that her intervention had kept the casualty list from being far longer. Their glances toward her carried both curiosity and a recognition they could not easily put into words. When the formal review ended, Robert was asked to remain with the senior officers. The others filed out, Sophia among them. But he stopped her at the door, his voice steady. "Wait outside. I will need you again." She nodded and stepped into the corridor, the hum of voices fading behind the closed door. She leaned against the wall, the cool metal at her back grounding her. Outside, the night air seeped through the cracks in the structure, carrying with it the scent of the ocean and the faint tang of burnt powder that seemed to cling to the base. Inside, Robert spoke with deliberate weight, recounting not just the sequence of events, but the precision of the shots, the impossibility of them without a level of training far beyond what her job title implied. He explained that the attackers had been positioned with skill, their fields of fire chosen, with an understanding of how to pin an elite unit. Yet they had been dismantled in less than 20 minutes by someone none of them had considered a combat asset. The room was silent when he finished, the senior officer at the head of the table finally asking where this woman had come from and why no one had known of her abilities. The truth was simple, Robert said. No one had asked. She had been working there for years, present at nearly every training cycle, and yet she had remained a ghost among them. He did not hide his own part in overlooking her, admitting that he too had failed to see past the uniform of her role. The officers exchanged looks, their expressions tight, the implications obvious. If someone of her capability had been overlooked here, how many others across the service were being missed because they did not fit a pre-written mold? When the door opened and Robert called her back in, Sophia stepped into the room with the same unhurried grace she carried in all things. The senior officer studied her for a long moment before speaking, his words careful. "Your actions today will be recorded in the after-action report. The details of your engagement will be classified, and there will be an inquiry into how someone with your skill set was not already in an operational role. For now, you will continue your duties, but be aware that the recommendation from this command will not be ignored." Sophia inclined her head, the acceptance simple, no outward sign of relief or pride, only acknowledgement. Days passed in a rhythm that felt both the same and entirely altered. She still arrived before dawn, still swept brass and patched targets, but the looks from the soldiers had changed. Conversations paused when she passed. Nods were offered, sometimes words. Robert began stopping by the range, not just to inspect, but to speak with her. Short exchanges about wind patterns, about shot groupings, about things that only someone who had lived behind a scope could understand. There was no formal announcement of what was coming, but she felt the shift, the quiet gravity of attention that had not been there before. Weeks later, she was called to a secure briefing room. The walls bare, the air cool, the table at the center holding only a thin folder and a steaming mug of coffee. Robert was there along with two officers she did not know by name, but recognized by bearing. They told her directly the recommendation for a direct commission had been approved. She would enter the Navy as an officer. Her assignment would be with the most advanced sniper program they operated. The words landed without ceremony, but they carried a weight that reached into every corner of her life. She thought of the years she had spent practicing alone, the competitions where her name was false, the mornings where she swept away the traces of others' marksmanship while hers remained unseen. She thought of her grandfather's hands adjusting her grip, his voice reminding her that the rifle was not the weapon. The mind was, she accepted the commission not with the rush of someone granted a sudden gift, but with the steady resolve of someone who had been ready for this long before the offer arrived. Robert escorted her out afterward, the corridor quiet except for the muffled sound of the sea beyond the walls. He told her she had earned every step, that the team had been changed by what happened, that he had been changed. His voice carried none of the formal distance from before. Now, it was the tone of one professional to another. He admitted that the greatest error a leader could make was to assume they already knew the measure of those around them. She replied only that the greatest error anyone could make was to believe they had nothing left to learn. That night, as she stood on the edge of the range, the wind rolling in from the water, the stars bright against the dark, she felt no need to imagine the future. It would come as it always did, in moments where skill met opportunity, and when it did, she would be ready, just as she had been when the first mortar fell, the sound of waves against the shore blending with the faint remembered echo of her grandfather's words. The rifle is just the tool. Your mind is the weapon. And now, finally, that weapon would no longer remain hidden in the shadows. The months that followed unfolded with the kind of discipline and intensity Sophia had always carried within her. But now it was channeled into a role that matched her skill. The Navy's Advanced Marksmanship Training Program was not a place for mediocrity. Every candidate who walked through its doors had already proven themselves in the field. Yet here, under her instruction, they learned that skill could always be sharpened further. Precision could always be refined, and patience was as deadly a weapon as any round chambered in steel. Her days began before the sun, the cold air of the range biting against her skin as she set up training drills. Her voice calm but unyielding as she walked students through wind calls, elevation adjustments, and the art of remaining unseen. She drilled into them the lessons her grandfather had given her, that the shot begins long before the trigger breaks, that the mind must be still even when the body is under fire, and that arrogance in a marksman is the fastest way to end up on the wrong side of a scope. Robert visited from time to time, no longer as her commanding officer, but as a colleague and ally. He would stand at the edge of the range, arms folded, watching the students struggle with the subtleties of her instruction. More than once she caught the faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he recognized pieces of her teaching style, small fragments of the battlefield where he had first seen her work. When they spoke, it was not about the past, but about the craft itself, about the shifting nature of warfare and the skills needed to meet it. The memory of that day at the training base never faded entirely, but it was no longer a story whispered among the soldiers who had been there. It had become a case study within the program, stripped of names in its classified form, but taught as an example of precision under pressure. Students would hear about the unknown shooter who dismantled a coordinated enemy assault in minutes, and though they did not know it was her, Sophia took a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her work was shaping not just individuals, but doctrine itself. In the evenings, when the last shots had been fired and the range lay quiet under the settling dusk, she often stayed behind, running her own drills in the fading light, pushing herself to see in the shadows, to calculate in near darkness, to test the limits of what could be done. She refused to allow the title or the uniform to dull the edge she had honed in silence for so many years for her. The real measure was not in recognition, but in readiness, in knowing that if the moment came again, she could step into it without hesitation. The people who had once overlooked her were no longer in her daily life. Yet the lesson they had taught her remained. Invisibility could be a weapon as sharp as any blade. It allowed her to observe, to learn, to prepare without interference. But it could also be a cage if one allowed others' perceptions to dictate their worth. She had stepped out of that cage when the fight demanded it, and she would never step back in. She carried that truth into every class, every lecture, every live fire, exercise, pressing it into the minds of those who might one day be overlooked themselves. Her students came from all backgrounds, some with long service records, some newly assigned, some carrying the quiet confidence of experience, others masking uncertainty with bravado. She treated them all the same, breaking down their habits, sharpening their instincts, pushing them to see that a rifle is nothing without the mind that guides it. Over time, even the most skeptical learned to listen, not because of her title, but because the results spoke for themselves. Shot groups tightened, times improved, awareness sharpened, and in each of them, she saw the potential to be the unseen force in some future battle. Robert's words from months ago still echoed in her mind. The most dangerous assumption a leader can make is thinking they already know the people around them. She had lived on the other side of that assumption, and now she made certain none of her students carried it into the field. She taught them to look deeper, to listen closer, to never assume that capability wears a visible badge. In her world, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, could be the decisive factor between victory and loss. Sometimes, late at night, she would think of her grandfather, wondering what he would make of this path. She liked to imagine him standing at the edge of the range, watching her work, the faint nod he might give when a student made the perfect shot under pressure. She could still hear his voice reminding her that patience was not the same as waiting. Patience was preparation in disguise, and preparation was the only real guarantee when opportunity came. Years from now, some of the men and women she trained would carry her lessons into places she would never see, into battles she would never fight. That was the nature of the work. You shaped the unseen edge of the blade, and then you let it go into the world, trusting it would cut when it needed to. She had no desire for medals or formal recognition. The quiet knowledge that her skill lived on in others was enough. On a clear morning near the end of a training cycle, Sophia stood with her class on the firing line, the targets glinting faintly in the far distance. The air was cool and still, the kind of air that made every sound sharp. She moved down the line, adjusting a stance here, correcting a grip there, then stepped back and let them work. The shots rang out in measured rhythm, the impacts marking steel and paper far downrange. She watched the students reset, ready for the next round, her mind already noting where each would need to improve. The sun climbed slowly, burning away the mist at the edges of the field, and she felt that quiet certainty settle in her again. The same certainty she had felt before climbing the tower that day. The knowledge that skill, once forged, could not be unseen forever. The world had a way of testing what you carried inside, and when it did, the only question was whether you had prepared enough to meet it. She had, and now she made sure others would too. On the horizon, beyond the distant targets, the sea shimmered under the rising light. Its surface calm for now, but she knew as well as anyone that calm never lasted. Somewhere, someday, there would be another moment, another hill, another unseen shooter waiting. And when that day came for her students, she hoped they would remember what she had taught them, that the mind is the weapon, the rest is just the tool, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the fight is the one you never thought to look at twice.